Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, we're definitely glad to have you. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Make sure you like and subscribe
Yeah, do all that
and hit the notification bell.
make it so our kids can actually look at us in the eye, and we can sort of be on par with the subscriber count that all their favorite
Mr. Beast, yes.
Yeah, I'm looking at you, Mr. Beast. Anyways, joining us this week, we have Molly Redden, right? Redden? Oh, nailed it. Who's an investigative journalist at ProPublica. She focuses on politics, voting, and democracy. She's also known for her in-depth reporting on issues of power and accountability, and has covered stories that reveal the inner workings of political strategies, government policies, and social justice. And we are so glad to have her here today to talk to us about Russell Vought. So welcome to the show, Molly.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess to start us out, you along with Andy Kroll recently wrote a ProPublica story that talks about key MAGA leaders' plans for a new Trump agenda, and I should point out that you wrote this story before the election. And I'm definitely going to be interested in kind of hearing sort of your take, post election. But what initially drew you to investigate this story?
What initially drew us is that, well, the story is based on some recordings we got of a man named Russell Vought, who runs a think tank that was really involved in putting together Project 2025, which I'm sure most of your listeners know, is a really broad blueprint for exercising executive power under the next Republican president to accomplish conservative goals. And the blueprint and the way that he described it was just a really expansive and compelling description of bypassing Congress and a way that a really strong president could single-mindedly execute his agenda. And that was, really in line with what Trump sort of described for his second administration. And so we wanted to dig into, this was a really good opportunity to dig into the how of it. Like, how would he just sort of unilaterally execute his second term agenda?
Wow, that's fascinating. So would you kind of describe what Vogt actually said? Why, I hear why you got interested in it, but what did he say, and why is it worth writing about? Why is it worth people hearing about? Why should we care? Essentially, who Vogt is and his agenda.
So Vogt in Trump's first term worked in this really obscure office called the Office of Management and Budget, which most people don't need to know about. But what it essentially does is it makes sure that federal spending is in line with the president's, whoever the president is, their agenda. And what Vogt has spent the last couple of years doing is coming up with essentially a legal theory for how the next Trump administration can do that without a lot of checks and balances from career civil servants or Congress. So if Congress says that money has to be spent for a particular purpose, finding sort of the legal argument around that, so that Trump can spend or not spend money as he pleases. And so that's why I think it's really important to take a close look at this. Is what Vogt has really done is come up with a blueprint for how the next president Trump can really pick and choose what federal money gets spent on. And you're already kind of seeing this theory bubble up around the efforts of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to cut a lot of what they find wasteful federal spending. Usually that takes the involvement of Congress. And you're starting to hear this theory that Vogt has developed be talked about as the vehicle for Ramaswamy and Musk to cut a lot of spending they don't like.
Do you have a sense at all of how like Vogt came into Trump's orbit? Kind of like why he was nominated to be the OMB director, like how their two seemingly strange paths cross to the extent that now he's kind of like he's like central casting and Trump orbit.
It's a good question because Vogt really did come up through like these traditional Republican and conservative groups that Trump has really sidelined in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think part of why he's remained so attractive to Trump's team is that he really is dedicated to keeping a lot of power in the executive branch and giving the president a lot of ability to do whatever his prerogatives are. And you can see in the way that Trump is picking his cabinet for his second term that is really what he is looking for, right? He's maybe not so much looking for expertise, subject matter expertise, but people he feels he can trust, people he feels will be really loyal to his agenda. And what Vogt is really offering is the tools to do that. And so I think that's why they've stayed really in each other's orbits. And also, Vogt, this is important to his vision of how federal government works. A really strong president who is not interested in traditional checks and balances. And so I think, there's just a lot of mutual interest there.
So when it comes to Vogt, and we've kind of been talking about this, like in terms of, getting a little bit of his background, getting a little bit of who he is. But I'd love for you to paint us a clear picture of who this individual actually is, kind of what his background is. Like again, like he came into this office, was a part of these conservative circles, got Trump's attention, and was enough to be put into this cabinet position. But what else do you think is relevant to understand about his background that would help us really wrap our minds around the significance that he's had and potentially may have?
Yeah, I think, right. I've been describing a lot about his sort of technical expertise in approaching and running a federal budget. I think what might also be useful to know about him is, well, I'm going to lay out a little bit some of the things he talked about in these speeches and what his sort of cultural vision for the country is, because I think, it's really important to keep in mind that what he wants to do in terms of the budget is really in service of a bigger vision for the country. So Vogt is really associated with, and his think tank also, Center for Renewing America, they're really associated with Christian nationalism, which is a big umbrella term for a broad movement, but generally it is associated with the far right and also with restoring the idea of Christian principles informing public life, informing policy decisions, really taking us back to a time when Christian leadership was more associated with the federal government. I mean, if you think about the early 1900s, it's sort of it's more like that vision of the country. So he has talked a lot about renewing America as a nation under God. That was one of the things he said in his speeches. he talked about Trump's candidacy and his presidency as a gift from God, allowing him to do this. He's clear that he is really scornful of a lot of modern rights movements and cultural ideas, such as trans rights. And let me pull up, there's a really vivid quote. I mean, he also is not interested in a country that is like run by bureaucracy. And he talked about trying to traumatically affect the bureaucrats that run the country. And what he's sort of talking about there is he envisions that the federal government will not really have a large workforce of civil servants who uphold regulations set by Congress. It'll be much more a federal government that is interested in carrying out like a really singular vision of the country, sort of like whatever Trump is interested in. And what he said was, we want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected when they wake up in the morning. We want them to not want to go to work because they're increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down so that the EPA can't do all of the rules against our energy industry because they have no bandwidth financially to do so. We want to put them in trauma. So these are some of the goals that what he's talking about doing with the power of the budget. Those are some of the goals that he is interested in.
Wow. So do you have any indication that Vogt might end up back in the Trump administration?
I mean, that was the expectation running up to the election. I think the range of cabinet picks so far has been, really surprising to people. I mean, there are people with some executive experience and technical expertise, and then there are a lot of people who appear to be chosen, like Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, RFK Jr. for HHS, more because they've shown usefulness and loyalty to Trump personally. So I think it's anybody's guess. I think a good sign that some of this, at least some of his agenda, is going to be really informative to a second Trump presidency is that budget cutting task force that Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are in charge of. This is not an existing piece of the federal government. This is going to be kind of created out of whole cloth. And in order for them to achieve any of these cuts, there would need to be some explanation, some legal vehicle for them to carry those out. And what they're describing is really in line with what Vogt has laid out.
Yeah, I was curious because obviously all of these cabinet administration picks that Trump has announced so far, I mean, nobody's been confirmed. So, at this point, we can have educated guesses on the likelihood that any of them will be confirmed. And I saw somebody post something yesterday on the platform formerly known as Twitter about how some of these picks are kind of like Russian dolls in the sense of we're going to assign Kristi Noem this thing and then people are going to be upset. So we're going to just, one up it and then assign Matt Gaetz to the Attorney General. And then people are going to be upset about that. Then we're going to announce that RFK is going to be the HHS secretary, and it's just like we're only going to talk about the most recent crazy appointment and sort of let some of the other ones slide. But with your mentioning of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which is I feel cringy just saying that, but like based on what you understand about this government efficiency, is that kind of like a building block in accomplishing maybe what some of the things that Russell Vought has said that he liked to do?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how close he is to either Vivek or Elon, so I don't know that they would be. And, of course, like those two have their own agenda. Like Elon, particularly, has his own financial interests in a lot of government spending. So I don't know how close that overlap is. I would say that, I mean, it's setting up a clash over federal spending, and basically if the executive branch has to spend money the way that Congress says they have to spend money, that is a clash that Vogt and some of his allies have really been looking forward to for a long time. It has to do with taking away the power of the purse from Congress. That is an enormous part of what Congress is supposed to do, right? They're democratic representatives of how we spend our taxpayer dollars, and then the executive branch is just sort of supposed to carry that out. And of course, whoever's in charge gets to, assert their own values around how they accomplish the goals of that spending. But yeah, I mean, it's really setting up a clash over, like, do we have to listen to Congress? Do we have to carry out their will when they pass budget laws? Or is Congress's job more to just hand us a large pot of money and we, the executive branch, will figure out how to spend it? And that is, that's kind of a dumbed down version of the Vogt goal. And so I think that's one place where there's a lot of overlapping interest.
So, one of the things that you said in your article, which was surprising to me and disturbing, if true, not necessarily if Vogt said it, but if it's actually something that's going to be implemented. That's what I mean, if true, was this idea of military deployment and crafting legal justifications to enable military, or really the use of military force against domestic protests and all the associated legal issues with that. Kind of dig into that a little bit more. What did he say, and how likely is it that this kind of thinking will actually be implemented in a Trump administration?
Well, first of all, I think it's really likely that you could see something like this under a Trump administration. In the summer of 2020, when there were mass protests over the murder of George Floyd, Trump, there has been a lot of reporting, and I think he's been pretty straightforward about this on the campaign trail too. He was really interested in deploying the military to put down some of the protests, and some of his top military officials, such as Joint Chiefs Mark Milley, basically somewhere on the spectrum of refused to talk him out of it. And Trump has talked about regretting that they didn't go forward with that. The distinction here, because I think a lot of people know that sometimes, governors will call in the National Guard during mass protests, and that sort of functions as a peacekeeping operation. Not to say that there aren't violent clashes between protesters and National Guard, and that there haven't been, but they're really there to, restore what the governor of that state thinks of as order. What Trump was talking about, and what he talked about on the campaign trail, was using the military to suppress and disperse protesters, violently if necessary. And that would be really, really unprecedented. And what Vogt talked about, and let me see if I'm going to find the quote. What Vogt talked about was sort of preparing the legal justifications for that. And then also just like imposing a military culture that would sanction that, so that you don't have a Mark Milley saying to the president this time around, like, that's not what we do. We don't deploy the military here domestically against our own citizens. So he's sort of talking about both, like on paper, coming up. He said that his organization was doing work right now. This was before the election, coming up with the legal justification for sending in the troops against protesters. And he said he described it as sort of having a shadow office of legal counsel. Office of Legal Counsel is, basically the president's lawyers. They tell the president when he's on the right side of the Constitution or on the wrong side of it. And he sort of talked about building up an Office of Legal Counsel in waiting who is ready to tell the president, yes, you can do that. But he also said something that I found really interesting about how Democrats were talking about Trump as a threat to democracy. And, this sort of flows into what I was saying about he also wants to create like a military culture that is okay with deploying against citizens. Democrats called Trump a threat to democracy a lot on the campaign trail. And he described that as not as them trying to get their voters out to the ballot box, not as a warning about our institutions, but he said it was like they were using coded language that the national security state uses overseas when they're overthrowing other governments. They're making Trump out to be a would-be dictator or an authoritarian. So they're actively working now to ensure on a number of levels that the military will perceive this as dictatorial and therefore not respond to any orders to quell violence. So I think like what he's essentially saying is they are using this hyperbole to try to, snow the military into not putting down protests, to not accept that as a marching order. And I thought that was really incredible.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy, and it's language that I know for me myself, I've got friend circles that would recite some of the things that you just mentioned to me. I mean, like I'm a former military, got a lot of military friends and non-military friends, but I tend to be like most people's only liberal progressive friend, and they've mentioned things like this to me in a variety of different shapes, forms, fashion, what have you. And I am kind of curious on like how much is Vogt using like the Center for Renewing America, which is like this, I don't know if it's a think tank or whatever, but like how much is he using this think tank to help achieve some of the goals he has, to provide these kinds of trainings to people, because I know that I subscribe to their newsletters. I got a letter from him, I don't know, a couple weeks ago with reference to like this military intelligence directive, like 5240. like I had somebody mail this or send this directive to me in a text and say, hey, Will, like, look, the government is trying to spy on Americans, like here's this directive, and like this is what your president's doing, kind of thing, and then I literally took me like 5-second Google search to realize, oh, this is something that's sort of been updated like multiple administrations. But the email I got from their organization, by Russell Vought, was, this is, this is the Biden administration spying on Americans, essentially. And he's using kind of like the infrastructure of his think tank. So I love to kind of, get your assessment on like how much is he using the Center for Renewing America to do all this? And doesn't that like violate, nonprofit laws or something like that?
So I'm not up to speed on how much like electioneering is the technical term a nonprofit can do. I think that they have a lot of allowance to do political messaging as long as it's not like for a specific candidate. But yeah, I mean, to your bigger question, I think the Center for Renewing America has definitely been, it spent part of the last 4 years before they really ramped up their work on Project 2025, road testing a lot of messages to help the sort of like new Republican Party. One really good example is they got very involved around the midterms. I mean, you probably remember around the midterms, Republicans being really heavily messaging around the border and around this idea that not only were there a lot of migrants crossing the border, which there were, but that it was an invasion, that this was sort of an organized, and you probably remember a lot of coverage around the caravan, that this was sort of like an organized, targeted incursion into the US and not just a huge mass movement of people migrating illegally over the border. So Vogt, in one of these speeches, he talked about how CRA, the Center for Renewing America, they got really involved in helping southern border governors message around the mass migration in a way that would get voters really angry. So they talked about, he and Ken Cuccinelli, who was a Department of Homeland Security official in Trump's first administration and has been a longtime hardliner on southern border issues. They set up a private meeting with the Attorney General of Arizona to try to convince him that you can actually issue a recommendation to the governor of Arizona saying that he can deploy his National Guard down to the border because we're being invaded. And that, constitutionally, that's a pretty radical idea. States aren't allowed to unilaterally declare war unless they're, I believe the phrase in the Constitution is being actually invaded. And so he was arguing that the mass migration meets that standard, which was a really out there idea at the time. And he talked about how the governor of, or the Attorney General of Arizona, actually took that idea up and ran with it. And then so did Texas. And it really got popularized, and they really helped fuel this idea of we're being invaded, we're under attack. This isn't just a migrant crisis. This is like a danger on par with a foreign military invading us. And they really helped foment that idea in 2022.
That is pretty wild. I'm glad. I mean, I don't know. I was going to say I'm glad that it didn't necessarily spread, but I'm actually not sure how much it did spread. I just never. I know. To my knowledge, we never declared war on anyone like Mexico or China or anything about that. So at least it didn't meet its ends there. But I'm super interested about the budget cutting, right? So we've mentioned Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, and of course Dogecoin, which maybe you should invest in Dogecoin, although I'm not a financial advisor, because it might jump up in price and get back to $1 after they see Doge as a department. But my question is, so he said this, and by the way, he said it. I just saw that he announced it on my birthday. So it's like Trump was giving me a birthday present with the
Happy birthday.
Department of Government Efficiency. I'm totally kidding. But I'm just wondering about it. Like, so he says it, but Trump can't just say it, and right, despite maybe popular belief, he can't just say it, throw his magic wand, and then it happens, right? To put a department into the government, that would require some kind of approval, right? Beyond just a president just saying, hey, this is what I want to do, therefore it's done. Like, that's going to require congressional approval. Not to say he won't get it, because of course he probably will with the Congress he has. But I'm just wondering about that. And then what do we really even know about this Department of Government Efficiency? Is it the boogeyman that I see a lot of people on the left saying it is? And or is there some kind of more middle stance? Or is it truly like, is it as bad as some of the things I'm hearing?
I mean, I think you've kind of asked, like, this is the $1 million question about the second Trump administration, right? Can Trump just say things and they will magically materialize? And of course, the answer is no. People have to cooperate. Like certain agencies have to cooperate. Congress has to cooperate. And I think this is the big question, right? Is Trump would like it to be so that he says, like, I can do this, and it gets done. And you can see that in his appointments, right? Like, he is choosing people who are, I mean, like, I don't think it's crazy to say just like not qualified, like don't have the obvious experience that would allow them to run gigantic, complex bureaucracies. A lot of these people either don't come with like the background to do it, or just a really like obvious set of skills. Like you don't have to have gone to Yale to run one of these departments, but you should bring sort of like an obvious competence. And
you would think
you've got senators openly talking about how his selection for attorney general, for example, Matt Gaetz is the now former representative from Florida, does not hold any obvious qualifications for this job, except that he's a really loyal defender of Trump. And so the question becomes, are other people in the party gonna play ball and wave him through? I think like an early test of this is the Senate gonna confirm these people? Trump and his allies have sort of floated the idea of just let me do recess appointments, which would be Congress adjourns voluntarily, because Trump can't do that unilaterally. So they step aside and they allow him to appoint people in their recess so that there's no Senate vetting of his cabinet appointees. There's no questions, there's no hearings. And, that would be a way for them to play ball, to comply, step aside, and let him do what he's interested in. Can Doge unilaterally cut $2 billion out of the U.S. budget? I mean,
trillion.
Thank you for the correction.
Both large numbers.
Yeah. Can they? I mean, if enough existing institutional dominoes around them fall, it would be a truly seismic shift in the way that, we spend federal dollars. And I think there are a lot of reasons based on, say, like Elon Musk's past commitments to seeing projects through to their end successfully. There are reasons to be skeptical that they're going to carry this off. Not to mention just Trump gets tired of people and fires them all the time. But I mean, the question really is like, will other people who have some actual authority here just step aside and say, yeah, go for it. And I really think that's the question, because like it's really clearly that is shaping up to be how Trump would like to run this administration. And he has a Republican Congress and he has a Republican Senate. But I'm sure a lot of Republican senators still think of themselves as having a job to do. And the question is, how compliant are they going to be to this person who, like, pretty clearly carried their party to this victory? Like, what kind of fealty do they feel toward that fact?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. And like I'm thinking about this department and I just wonder, like, I mean, on its face, and I know like terms efficiency, that's like such a a broad term, and it's open to what does that mean to make something efficient? And that's the major question, right? And at the same time, it does feel like to me, there's a lot of waste in the government. There's a lot of inefficiencies. Maybe some of these departments would do well to be trimmed down. And so, what is the major concern? It's that essentially. Well, let me just ask that. I don't need to try to answer it. I'll let you answer it. What is the major concern about this idea of trimming things down and making things more efficient? Because to a lot of people, they're going to be like, "Yeah, government should be more efficient. My business, if it's not efficient, it's going out of business. I don't have the power to tax people who don't have a choice whether or not they pay those taxes, right? It's essentially coercion because you get legal repercussions if you don't pay your taxes. So, I mean, or the businesses get their licenses removed, they get, banned or whatever it is, right? So I don't see, I think the problem I'm getting at that I'd love for you to address is there's a lot of people that will probably look at that and say it's about dang time that the government has some accountability in getting more efficient. And yet there seems to be a lot of apprehension about this. And so I'd love for you to kind of unpack that for us and help us understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to your point, there are a lot of times that like people, particularly companies, interface with the government and they're just like, this is really inefficient. Like, I need this stamped piece of paper. It's taking me 7 months. I think I think genuinely what people are worried about is there's good efficiency, right? There's like bipartisan agreement around energy permitting reform, making it easier to upgrade and modernize our energy grid so that, energy reaches us more reliably and more cheaply. Everyone's down with that. And then there are major cuts to the government that sort of masquerade as efficiency that are really more ideological cuts because you don't like it. And I think that is what people are sounding the alarm about. And I'll even add a third kind, which is cuts that are made really haphazardly by people who don't really understand these government functions. And, maybe because like they're coming from the private sector, or they don't really have their arms around what this or that agency does. And so on its face, like, well, this looks unimportant, and it gets cut, or it gets sort of strangled off or shrunk down. And it turns out like, oh, that's really important. And I think, falling in that second category of like ideological cuts because you don't like it, a really big talking point over the last couple of years has been cutting back on IRS enforcement and a lot of money set aside in Biden's IRA bill act to up the ranks of IRS investigators. And at least that's how it was framed. A lot of what that money does, the money kind of does two things, which is it just, one, adds more tech support to the IRS. So ordinary citizens calling and saying like, hey, I got this error message when I tried to file my taxes, or hey, did you receive this? Or, hey, I need this form. This is confusing me. Or like, I need to correct this issue from, 2 tax years ago. Can just like get someone on the phone. That's been a huge issue. And then the other half of it is upping IRS enforcement against very wealthy tax dodgers. And that's a really good example of that's an ideological cut, right? If you get rid of those people, it takes money off the federal budget and it looks like you've saved the government money. What you've actually done is made it harder for the government to tax ultra wealthy people accurately. That's an ideological cut. That's you and your rich buddies don't want to pay taxes. And I think that is a version that really worries people.
So when like you wrote the story as a result of obtaining some videos of speeches that Vogt gave, and I'm curious on like what's the context in which these speeches were given. Was it like a part of some big fundraising kind of thing, or was it just like a small gathering, a meeting, or a small gathering of like-minded individuals? And if you can speak on it, I'd love to know like who else was in attendance in these meetings, if you have that information.
Yeah, so these were sort of like annual events hosted by the think tank that he runs, the Center for Renewing America. In the videos, you can't actually see the audience, so I can't tell you how big the audience he's speaking to is, but based on the applause and the laugh lines, like it's a full room, right? And based on some of the things he says as an introduction, it's pretty clear that who he is speaking to are folks who are really aligned with the goals of the think tank. So like Chip Roy and Scott Perry, who are further to the right in the U.S. House of Representatives. They were there, or they were at least on some of the promotional materials. At one point, you can hear him talk to Chip Roy. Steve Bannon also spoke at one of these gatherings. And then based on what he said sort of early in one of these speeches, it's clear that a lot of donors are there. A lot of people who donated to not only the Center for Renewing America, but some of the other groups in sort of the larger constellation of Trump allies and Project 2025. At one point, I believe he thanks some of the people and encourages them to keep donating to the legal defense fund for some of the first Trump administration officials who were involved in trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And so that is an organization, or that's a legal defense effort, he shouts out. So there are people with like serious money in the crowd also.
Man, I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of like, if you're going to say stuff like, I want to, traumatize all these civil like service workers and just basically make their life hell. I mean,
pretty sure that line got a laugh from the audience too.
Really?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and watch the video, but like, I'm pretty sure there were guffaws.
Wow. So I mean, like, is this stuff that you get the sense Vogt is in any way embarrassed by the information being out there, or is he just naturally a firebrand and he kind of takes it as a point of pride that ProPublica is reporting on what he's saying?
I mean, we never heard from him directly, even though we really encouraged him to talk to us. So I couldn't tell you if he's excited or not that these are out there. I would say like he does bring this level of intensity to his public speeches. And that's been true of a lot of the people surrounding Trump for the last 4 years and like on up to Trump himself. It was news to us that Vogt was working on the legal justification for deploying the military against peaceful protesters, it was not news that Trump was interested in doing that because he talked about it on the campaign trail. And I think one feature of the last 4 years is just sort of an increasing openness around the really drastic changes that Trump and everyone around him is interested in pursuing for the country. Some of those are popular. Some of those, it seems like a lot of voters just sort of held their noses and said, maybe he won't do that. Maybe he's joking. But regardless, like, they're talking about it openly.
Yeah, it's also like confusing sometimes to try to figure out who's being honest, what's really, being planned, what's really going to be able to go through. Like, for instance, I've heard, obviously, anyone who's followed politics, right, at all over the last few months has heard about Project 2025. We've mentioned it in this conversation. There's a lot of fear and concern surrounding this, anxiety surrounding this on the left. There's some, I've talked to some people about it and they're like, yeah, I don't know if he's really going to do that. I mean, he says a lot of things and he said he had nothing to do with, one person in particular I talked to is like, well, Trump said he had nothing to do with Project 2025 and has completely distanced himself from it. I'm like, okay. And trying to figure out, so why are people so concerned and why has this been such a loud thing, like a megaphone topic for news to portray this kind of understanding of what Trump's going to do, this prediction of how Trump's going to act. And in particular, I would love for you to kind of address this Project 2025 broadly, but even specifically narrow in on the 180-day transition playbook. And what is that? What is it saying? How is it connected to Vogt? And I know I threw a lot out there, so whatever you want to talk about, just hit it on those topics.
Yeah, I mean, to your first question, I think there are a couple of reasons that a lot of people have remained really like justifiably alarmed about Project 2025 if it's not in line with your vision of how you want things to work. And, that's because first, Trump distanced himself from it on the campaign trail. I think he rightly sensed that, a lot of the ideas in it really freaked people out and it was unpopular. And Trump doesn't like to be associated with things that are unpopular. And so, despite him distancing himself from it, though, there was a lot of really decent reporting that a ton of the people involved in writing it were involved in helping him get elected, working for his campaign or working for the broader constellation of groups that supported his campaign. There was reporting that he was, spent time on a private jet with Kevin Roberts, whose group, the Heritage Foundation was really at the center of putting this together. So I think people had good reason to be skeptical that he was as unaware of it as he said. And then I think the second half is part of Project 2025, one way that, and this gets into your question about the transition plan, part of what they really sought to do was come up with a really large pool of people who could staff the federal government, who are, loyal to MAGA ideas and could maybe replace a lot of the civil servants that they want to get rid of. And so, Trump can't do any of Project 2025 on his own. I mean, he's not really known for being an in the weeds guy. And, no president really does the day-to-day work of carrying out any particular agenda. It's about who works for you, who comes in the door behind you. And so I think a lot of people understand that, sure, Trump might not be deeply invested in some of Project 2025's proposed restrictions for abortion and abortion medication. But if HHS or the DOJ is staffed with people who do care and do want to carry that out, yeah, there's a pretty good chance that there are going to be a lot of those new restrictions. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of why there was that kind of alarm.
So what's next, I guess, for you? You're reporting on this particular topic. I mean, it's mid-November now. Obviously, we're still a month or so away from certification of the votes and swearing in. But what kinds of things are you going to be looking for, and maybe even more broadly, like what should just the general public be looking for, kind of with the relationship between Vogt and Trump?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm watching for, does Vogt succeed in getting a significant appointment in the second Trump administration? Trump is filling out his cabinet pretty rapidly. And then, we'll move on to some of the lower non-cabinet positions. And generally, I'm watching those names for, I think, earlier we kind of talked about this question of like, can he do this? Can he pull off, Trump, a lot of the really extreme changes that he is talking about and promising? And part of that is, are other institutions going to play ball? And then part of that is also, is he going to select people with the understanding of government that will allow him to do the things that he's talking about? Because like you said, he can't just wave a magic wand. He needs people who know know which drawers stuff is in, who know how to operate the levers of government. I mean, in order to carry out your ideology through government function, you do need that. And so far, he's not. Yeah, I mean, he's choosing some people who have been in charge of big executive operations, like Doug Burgum for Interior Secretary, and then he's choosing people who just don't have that background. And I think once you start to see some of these lower down staff positions be filled up, the people who aren't necessarily the big picture people, but the people in charge of executing just basic government business, are they going to be more loyalists? Are they going to be more people who were very good at defending Trump on the House floor or on Fox News? Or are they going to bring actual expertise of how government works? And I think that's going to tell us a lot about how much he can accomplish.
I think that's so true what you said, because there are, I mean, like, there are just basic blocking and tackling functions that people have to know in government. It may seem almost comical to some, but it's like, if you're behind your computer and you hit print, do you know which printer it's going to go to? Because that could be a national security issue, and it's like, if he's not appointing the right people, not necessarily printing documents, but still basically like just understanding how the system, the government, the structure, the White House, work is really going to be instrumental in Trump being successful. So how can people find you, Molly, and follow the work that you're doing?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky. My handle for both is @MTRedden. You can find me at ProPublica. And if you ever have an interesting tip, you can find me on Signal, and my number is in all my social media handles. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And it was just such a pleasure. And we'd love to have you back sometime once the Trump administration gets off the ground. So yeah, thanks so much. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. And remember, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.